Well, I am thrilled to welcome historian and geopolitical big thinker Hal Brands back to our leadership series. Hal, it's your third time. Rarefied air, my friend. You, Derek Thompson, a very few Bill McInturf, of course, but you just came out with, by my count, your 11th book, The Eurasian Century: Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World. Is it number 11?
That could be right. But I'm thrilled to be an appearance number three. I'm gunning for that set of steak knives, so I'm gonna keep coming back as often as you'll have me.
We'll keep having you. My only regret is I didn't have you between the Twilight Struggle and this book, which was Danger Zone, which is one of my very favorites. That's so good. The themes flow throughout all of them. I thought the book was awesome. It's really valuable history, but it's also incredibly relevant as it's intended to be to the world we're all living in, which is a scary and a fraught world. So I'm going to start. I've got a lot of questions. As I gave Hal a warning at the start, I will at some point be asking whether he thinks we are destined for war, World War III, God forbid. But that question's coming. But let's start at the basics. Given what you've already written, as you were thinking after Danger Zone about your next book, why this? What do you feel like you hadn't tackled that you were eager to tackle? And what in Eurasian Century, which, as always, we bought 100 copies. Just I've not been adequately clear with folks. Once we run out of giving them to attendees, we've run out. You got to go to Amazon for more than 100. But we'll send a link for everybody who sticks around for this conversation to get up to 100 copies that we already bought for people at no cost. Why'd you write this, and what's your core takeaway?
So I wanted to go a little bit broader and a little bit deeper than what I did in Danger Zone. And for those who haven't read Danger Zone, it's basically an argument about why the competition with China could be coming to a head sooner rather than later. And I wanted to go broader than that by putting the US-China rivalry in the context of the larger set of issues that are unfolding today, where you have very high tensions in Europe, very high tensions in the Middle East, in addition to the Asia Pacific, but then also go deeper and putting them in historical context. And the historical context that I think is relevant here is that what we're seeing today actually just represents the fourth round in a much longer running struggle for Eurasia. And so really for the past century plus, for technological and geographical reasons, I'm happy to talk in more detail about, Eurasia has really been the strategic center of the world. It's where the action happens in global politics. And the major drama has been the efforts of aggressive countries located within Eurasia to carve out big spheres of influence to conquer or control vast swaths of that landmass, and then use it as a platform for global expansion and global predation. And then the efforts of offshore powers, so first the United Kingdom and then America and their allies, to prevent that from happening. And in capsule version, that is really the story of World War One. It's the story of World War Two, and it's the story of the Cold War. And the fourth chapter of that story is playing out today, where Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, they are all trying to assert their influence within particular key regions of Eurasia, East Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and so on and so forth. And in doing so, they're also posing a larger global challenge to the balance of power across the Eurasian landmass and to the international system that the US and its friends have run for the past 80 years.
So the history nerd in me wants to debate whether and why you didn't include Napoleonic adventures, which I would think would be the original OG. So this would be the fifth, but I don't want to go there because I'm more interested in where we are and where we're going. And you write about the new axis, which are those four countries: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, who are closely partnering on technology, on economic, on military affairs. And the question I spend a lot of time trying to understand and read about right now is the new axis dangerous because they're weak or because they're strong? One of the key points in Danger Zone was what makes China dangerous, particularly, is they may conclude, given their demography, given a variety of other things, including their economy right now, that they're never going to be stronger relative to the United States. They're going to be weaker as AUKUS and other things kick online. So China has economic and demographic challenges. Russia has spent a whole lot of blood and treasure. They may be winning at the moment on the ground in Ukraine, but they've paid a huge price. Iran has been massively defanged by Israel in many ways. North Korea remains fundamentally a hermit kingdom. Do you see their threat in that combined they're a stronger, or like the old axes of old, super dangerous because of their strength, or because they're all realizing they may not win unless they act soon?
I think what makes this group dangerous, and really what's made a lot of the countries you just mentioned historically dangerous, is this peculiar cocktail of weakness and strength. And so there's no denying that Russia today is much stronger than it was in the early post-Cold War era when it was flat on its back and it just couldn't do anything to obstruct the expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe or US intervention in the Balkans or anything else that Russia didn't like during that period. The growth of Chinese power over the past 45 years has been phenomenal in economic terms, and now in military terms, where China is, putting dozens of ships to sea each year in a way that really puts the US and other democratic navies to shame. And so these countries have become strong enough that they can pose a real threat to the balance of power in the regions they inhabit. But they are also dangerous because they are insecure. They're insecure, all of them, in an ideological sense, and that they are all dictatorships, autocracies that are trying to make it in a world that has been run and structured for a long time by a democratic superpower. And that creates a certain existential angst about the ways in which the world can be lethal to their regimes. And then in particular cases, they are often motivated by a sense that they're running out of time or they're running up against obstacles. And so one of the things that motivated Putin's invasion of Ukraine was his sense, I think it was wrong, but I think he believed it, that if he didn't move soon, Ukraine was going to become integrated into the West and it was going to become a member of NATO, and Russia's strategic situation would be worse. I think one of the things that has Xi Jinping looking like a man in a hurry today is that he knows that China's economic performance is not great. If he looks out at the world, he can see more and more of these anti-China coalitions taking shape. And so he's going to be tempted to push harder in this period where China's military prowess, its military advantages may be at their peak. And so it may sound like a waffly answer, but I think a lot of the most dangerous behavior in international politics comes at this strange intersection.
Let's talk North Korea, who's not quite one of these kids, is not like the others, but they're the weirdest of the new axis. Why are North Korean soldiers killing Ukrainians, and why are some of them dying so far from home?
This is a really fascinating question because if you wind the tape back to February 24th, 2022, when the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine begins, I can't think of a single person who was then predicting that Russia and China within 2 or 3 years would sign a full-fledged military alliance and North Korea would deploy its soldiers to fight alongside Russia on those battlefields. This is one of these things that just kind of came out of nowhere. I think there's a few ways of explaining it. One, it's part of a larger phenomenon in which the Ukraine war has sped up history. And in particular, it has sped up this process of alignment between and among the bad guys, the countries that are challenging the existing international system. Russia and China, Russia and Iran, Russia and North Korea, they had these relationships going back a long time, but the development of those relationships has been turbocharged in the past 3 years, primarily because Russia has become more isolated from the West, and so it's had to double and triple down on its relationships with, call it the global East or the Eurasian autocracies or whatever the proper phrase is. And it's been willing to trade away more goodies, particularly in the form of high-end military technology, to get the sustenance it needs to keep fighting in Ukraine. And so that's one reason why North Korean troops are fighting alongside Russian troops right now. There's some quo for the quid. It's a little bit hard to tell exactly what it is, but it probably comes in the form of sale of more sophisticated Russian military gear to North Korea, perhaps provision of technological know-how that could be useful in North Korea's satellite program or its closely related missile program, perhaps even its nuclear program. It's certainly coming in terms of Russia's diplomatic protection of North Korea from the UN sanctions regime. And I think that's one big issue here. But there's another piece of this which could be even more troubling. And some of the reporting has indicated that this was not a case where Putin went to Kim and said, "Give me 12,000 troops." It's a case where Kim went to Putin and said, "Wouldn't it be great if I sent some troops to fight in Ukraine?" And presumably the reason he wants to do that is in part to get those troops bloodied, perhaps not as bloody as they are, but to get them some battlefield experience in case that comes in handy in a conflict on the Korean Peninsula, for instance. And so one of the challenging and worrying things about this deployment is what it might tell us about what Kim Jong-un thinks he's getting ready for in the coming years.
All right, so a question I know military and government leaders are asking you and everybody's thinking about right now are what are the next moves for the new axis in Trump 2.0? In 1.0, it seemed like they were content to grow their soft power. And in the Biden years, they started flexing their hard power, perceiving the US as not wanting to do more engagements. And do they see the return of Trump, in your estimation, as an opportunity or as a threat to their long-term goals?
I think it really depends and it varies based on the country. And so I think the country that is most immediately concerned about Trump's return is probably Iran, because Trump has made no secret of the fact that he's planning on returning to the maximum pressure economic sanctions campaign of his first term. There's a little bit of uncertainty about what the goal will be. Will it be to get a better, stronger nuclear deal with Iran? Will it be to try to bring about the implosion of the regime? There's probably some debate about that within the incoming Trump administration, but certainly Iran is in for a tough time under Trump, in part because they've been so significantly weakened by Israel over the past 6 to 8 months. If you go to Russia, I think Russia probably views Trump more as an opportunity than as a challenge. Trump has been very clear that he wants to bring the Ukraine war to an end. He's been fairly clear that he doesn't have strong preferences as to what that settlement looks like as long as the war ends. And so I have to think that Putin is hoping, perhaps believing, that a combination of continued battlefield pressure on Ukraine and then sort of playing on Trump's desire for a settlement might allow him to get some sort of advantageous deal in Ukraine, or just to separate Ukraine from the US and Ukraine from its European partners. So I think Putin is a bit more optimistic. With China, I think it's a real muddle because I think there is a mixture of concern and a sense of opportunity at the same time. And so, on the one hand, Chinese officials hope that Trump will act as a wrecking ball within America's alliances, and they hope that if he does so, it will give them a little bit of a respite from the pressure that they have faced as the advanced democracies have mostly turned against China over the past 5 to 6 years. At the same time, the Chinese are clearly concerned about some of the economic measures that Trump may have in store for them. The Chinese economy is already in a weak position, and the Chinese have been signaling to Trump that they're worried about this by saying, if you start layering tariffs on us, we've got export controls we can use. We have a variety of other measures we can move to push back. And so I think there's a mix of danger and opportunity from Beijing's perspective.
Do you think there's any chance that the Trump team can, just like the Putin is hoping to separate the U.S. and the EU, and NATO from Ukraine? Is there any sense that the new axis might get broken apart or splintered or divided, and thereby avoiding, ganging up?
I think it's hard to do that in a strategic way in the near term because whatever the differences among them, the members of the new axis have two really important things in common. The first is that they all view the United States as their primary enemy and the primary obstacle to what they want to achieve in international affairs. And the second is that they are all autocrats trying to make it in a world where democratic norms have been prevalent and even dominant in recent decades. So there's a fair amount of glue there. And they're not dumb. They know that the US is going to try to wedge them apart. They're on guard against that. I do think there are a couple of opportunities to sort of tactically play on potential rifts within these relationships, or at least to start the long process of introducing strains there. Opportunity one comes with Iran and Russia. And so Trump is going to put all this economic pressure on Iran. He's probably going to try to create a fear in Tehran that there's a prospect of a U.S. or Israeli military strike on the nuclear program. And he's going to demand a bunch of stuff. And one of the things that he might demand would be that Tehran cease providing drones and other military kit to Russia for use in Ukraine. And he might plausibly be able to get that. Even if he can't, there's maybe some value in a confrontational policy toward Iran, because I think what it will demonstrate is that Tehran's new friends, the Russians, are not going to be there for them in a major crisis. Russia is not going to commit suicide on behalf of Iran's nuclear program if Iran looks like it's going to get schwacked by the US and Israel. And that's important because historically, one of the ways in which these type of alignments have started to fracture is when one country concludes that the other one isn't showing up for it in the way they expected. The second tactical opportunity, just briefly, is if Trump really intensifies sanctions against the Chinese entities, and particularly the Chinese banks that are facilitating Russia-China trade and strategic goods, the stuff that's sort of keeping Putin in the war and helping him rebuild his defense industrial base. I think in general, anything that makes Beijing pay a higher price for the support it's providing to Russia is a good thing, because at a certain point, it has to lead someone in the Chinese system to wonder whether Beijing is getting the best of this deal or not.
All right, so I warned you. Um, do you think the U.S. and our allies and the new Axis will go to war sometime this decade? What do you think the precipitating events will be, and do you think there is a way to somehow stop it from becoming nuclear World War III?
So it depends a little bit on the scenario. And if the scenario, if satisfying the criteria here requires a global war between the US and its alliance blocks on the one hand, and then, all four or three or four of the Eurasian autocracies on the other, I think the odds of that remain relatively low, although they are non-trivial enough that I think we have to take the prospect seriously. If the question is, might the United States go to war with one or more of the Eurasian autocracies? I think the odds are much higher. I don't know if I would, bet on that as opposed to it not happening. But when you put together the prospect of a crisis over the Iran nuclear program in the next 2 or 3 years, with rising tensions with China in the Pacific, with the perpetual danger that North Korea will escalate in some way or another, and the fact that it could eventually become, you could eventually face a choice between intervening directly in Ukraine and sort of seeing a Russian victory there. That's a pretty worrying scenario for me. I will say, though, I think that the key question for policymakers isn't sort of, what are the odds of this happening in a vacuum? It's what can we do to reduce the odds of this happening over the next 5 to 10 years? And part of that involves good old-fashioned diplomacy and a little bit of reassurance. And so I'll just give one example of something I think the U.S. ought to do in the interest of prudent diplomacy. There has been some talk, including by some folks who are influential with the incoming administration, to the effect that the U.S. should ditch its one China policy and extend diplomatic recognition to Taiwan, or otherwise move toward a pretty significant change in its sort of declaratory posture in the Taiwan Strait. I think that would be bad. I think that what the U.S. needs to do in that relationship is basically convince everybody that it's simply trying to maintain a very fraught status quo, because if it makes big changes, it may sort of convince Beijing that it has no choice but to use force. So that's one piece of it. But the second piece of it is simply that there's going to need to be a much bigger and collective democratic, free world effort to shore up the defenses of the international order. The real problem, as I see it, is that the U.S. and its friends still have a post-Cold War approach to defense at a time when the international system looks ever more like the run-up to World War II. And so when you look at what the U.S. and its friends are spending on defense, 1.5% of GDP, 2.5% of GDP, 3% of GDP in the U.S. case. It doesn't need to go to 10% of GDP. But if the U.S. wants to deter conflict in these regions and give itself the option of responding when adversaries press, I think it's just going to need much more military power in concert with its allies than they collectively possess today.
I want to turn on that, although I know it's funny. I heard when I heard you that saying that phrase, the line I underlined in your op-ed here in the Post, and yeah, I'm old school, hard copy. The United States has a post-Cold War military in a pre-World War world, which was really powerful, kind of chilling, but that's the point you just made. One of the cool things in the book is you talk about how technology has consistently changed who's powerful, who can project power, and how some of these great strategists perceived it. First, it was the railroads and the ability to move troops across the Eurasian continent in a way that shrank the geography. Then it was sea power and the ability to contain and to move on the outer perimeter, and then ultimately air power. Um, we're in another period of massive technological advance and disruption. And I take a look at whether it's cyber or whether it's in space or whether it's in missiles and hypersonic missiles, and it feels like what you wrote about, and maybe you could summarize again here how technology reshaped both who had power and who perceived their ability to leverage power, but project it forward into the new technologies. And does it change who has power? It sure feels like it changed who's at risk, because the U.S. wasn't at risk as much with giant oceans, and now there are no oceans really when it comes to cyber or when it comes to space.
Yeah, it's a great issue to dive into. In some ways, the general trend of the last century, and the general trend almost throughout history has been the shrinking of geography as technological breakthroughs open up new opportunities for power projection. And as you mentioned, it was the railroad, and particularly the completion of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the early 20th century, that really ushered in this new era. In World War II, it's the combination of armor and air power on the battlefield, and then aircraft carrier-based aviation on the oceans that really turns that into a war of movement on a global scale. During the Cold War, in many ways, the critical question is whether nuclear weapons will or will not stabilize the international system and the set of alliances that the US and its friends had created to try to prevent another Eurasian conflict from breaking out. And underlying all this is a set of economic changes. And so by the time we get to the end of the Cold War and into the early 21st century, we're in sort of a different economic era than we were when this period began. And so at the beginning of the Eurasian century, economic leadership was really a function of dominance in mass manufacturing. And that was what made the US the economic juggernaut, really from the late 19th century onward. And it was why US intervention in the two world wars was so decisive, because the United States was sort of unique in the sense that its production facilities were mostly outside of the reach of the destructive power of the enemy. Like you couldn't bomb the factories that were making B-24s in Detroit, right? It was too far. And yet the United States had enough oceanic power to bring that might to bear on Eurasian battlefields. By the end of the Cold War, it's shifting. And so yes, manufacturing is still very important, but increasingly we're moving into information age economies. Digital technologies are becoming much more important. And those are what enable some of the military breakthroughs, precision-guided munitions, for instance, that give the US the upper hand at the end of the Cold War and then into the post-Cold War era. Today, we are in another era of rapid technological innovation, and I think this is really playing out in a handful of different dimensions at once. Let me just mention a couple of them. The first is the question of which country or set of countries will dominate the economic and technological innovation, or I should say the technological innovations that will underpin economic and military power in the coming decades. And so when you hear people get very excited about the potential for artificial general intelligence in the coming years, or quantum, or advanced robotics and things like that, that's really what they're talking about. The sense that there is a set of technologies that will have the potential to dramatically increase the productivity and the economic power of societies that master them. And so this is one of the reasons why the US has been so keen to try to preserve a lead in these technologies. And you may have seen just on Monday, I believe it was, the Biden administration rolled out new guidelines for technological diffusion, which basically represent an effort to prevent the bad guys from getting their hands on some of the enablers of these technologies. The second dimension of this is the way that new technologies are changing the battlefield and either easing or making more difficult the task of power projection. And so let me just give one example of this. There's a lot that we could talk about, but basically what's happened in the Western Pacific over the past 3 decades is that China has built up a suite of what are sometimes called anti-access area denial capabilities, attack submarines, anti-ship missiles, advanced air defenses that are meant to make it really costly for the US to project power into the Western Pacific and thereby make it less costly for China to project power against countries nearby. So if the US can't sail its aircraft carriers within 500 miles of China because they're going to get hit with ballistic missiles, it makes it much easier for China to conquer Taiwan. What the US is now trying to do in turn is to develop its own suite of anti-access area denial capabilities. And so we're setting up marine units that are going to deploy on little islands that are relatively close to Taiwan and shoot anti-ship missiles at Chinese forces. The commander of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has talked about creating a hellscape in the Western Pacific by using lots of UAVs and UUVs, drones basically, in the air and in the water to attrit a Chinese invasion fleet or blockade force. So we see in real time the way in which technological innovation is being married to military operational concepts in crucial theaters.
All right, a big part of your book. There's so much more I want to get into. By the way, you're talking about we need to spend more. We also need to spend differently. Maybe it's fewer aircraft carriers and more of these drones, but maybe we'll get there. Maybe we won't. A lot of historians, you included in the book as well, talk about the importance of economics. That it's not merely who's built the most stuff or who can crank out the most missiles, but that economic policy both can strengthen alliances and can precipitate conflict. The protectionism of the 20s and the 30s helped lead the Cold War. The Marshall Plan, U.S. trade policies helped the West be a stronger alliance that ultimately outcompeted communism. Have you seen ever an environment where squeezing your enemies economically works, where it ultimately leads them to say uncle and it gets better? Because when you wrote about both here, but also in the last couple of books, World War I, World War II, it's folks who feel that they're being strangled often strike.
It's a really interesting question. Part of it depends on when the squeezing is happening. And so it's true that a fear of economic containment helps push Germany to take a bunch of risks before World War I. It's also true that the British naval blockade helps squeeze Germany into a place where it's in a pretty bad situation by 1916 and 1917. So it's a valuable tool of war, even if economic tensions helped bring on the war. The classic case of economic sanctions or economic pressures bringing on a war is often thought to be the US-Japan relationship in the run-up to World War II. In one way, which is very well known, which is the application of an oil embargo and an asset freeze on Japan about 6 months before Pearl Harbor, but also in a way which is less known, which is that when the US imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, it basically cut Japanese exports in half overnight, and it made Japan all the more attracted to trying to create a big economic empire in places like Manchuria. And so it sort of helped push Japan down the path to aggression. That's not to say that, the US is responsible or isn't responsible for that. It's just that there is a cause and effect relationship here. In the Cold War, the issue is a little bit different. I think that economic and technological denial policies played an important role in preventing the Soviet Union from getting its hands on what were then advanced integrated circuits, right? Which was important to the military balance. But what was really crucial was the positive sum economic relationship that took hold within the West during the Cold War. And so you mentioned the Marshall Plan. There were also the GATT agreements that basically created the international trading system that we know today, which is hanging on by a thread today. And all of that had the effect of turbocharging growth within the Western world, which helped mute conflicts within the Western world, but also just helped the Western world overpower and outperform the Soviet Union over time. I think that's relevant because if you think about where we are now, the US and China are likely headed for a greater degree of decoupling over the next decade, although we can argue about how great that degree will be or should be. So if the US wants to continue to reap the benefits of globalization, it's going to have to deepen its economic relationships with friendly countries as it rolls back some of that integration with unfriendly countries. And I think that's one of the areas where the US has struggled over the past decade. It's not a statement about one party or another. I think both parties have been in more or less the same place on this. But I think in general, if we're headed into a more economically balkanized world, we need more integration with our friends rather than less.
So as you point out in the book too, the strategy to integrate with Asian allies to better contain China was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which
Right.
TPP became a four-letter word in Washington in the 2016 campaign, and it's a bummer. Separate even and apart from that, so much that one reads these days suggests that the U.S. is not prepared. Like I read about all the war games, we've got better tech, but we just run out of stuff. We make 4% of the world's steel. We don't really make ships anymore. We were the arsenal of democracy. We're kind of now the bank of globalization. Um, the question becomes, is there time to reindustrialize and to otherwise set ourselves up to be able to bring, I mean, the book talks about in history, it's the ability to bring mass. Is that gone? Can that be restored in a world where there are intercontinental ballistic missiles? Even if you had a factory in Detroit, isn't a factory in Detroit hittable?
Candidly, I don't know whether there is time. If a war, heaven forbid, were to break out in the Western Pacific tomorrow or a year from now, or even 2 years from now, even if the US started investing in its defense industrial base in a major way today, I don't know that we would be in a place where we could rapidly refill munitions once we run out of them. I don't think we would be in a place where we would be able to easily replace ships or submarines that were lost in combat. I think aerospace, we're doing a little bit better. The defense industrial base is better there, but that's more the exception than the rule. I think what we can say is that we know that the U.S. is not prepared in any meaningful way from an industrial perspective for conflict today. I'll give you an example of this. One of the reasons the United States has essentially lost the war in the Red Sea to the Houthis over the past 15 months is that the United States has felt that it can't really get tough with the Houthis because if it does, it's going to run out of the Tomahawk missiles and precision-guided munitions it might need if trouble breaks out in another part of the world, particularly in East Asia. And so this weakness of the defense industrial base is having effects in real time. And the longer this situation goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. And so while I can't tell you with confidence that if we spend another, $100 billion tomorrow, we'll be in good enough shape by 2027, I can say that the world's not going to get any less ugly between now and the time when we start to make those investments.
Man, the Houthi Tomahawks makes me think of the Seinfeld Spongeworthy episode, but boy, is one frivolous and one serious. All right, I've got two more questions. You do a lot of talks with like defense war college types, with think tanks, but also with business leaders who are running, who are both trying to get their handle on what may happen, but also who are running global operations. And we work with a bunch too. And from time to time, when I basically just steal a bunch of your stuff and others' stuff and put it into my presentations. I often get asked, what do you think we ought to do with supply chain, or we don't want to run away from a market that's currently available to our competitors. And if you're selling into the market, you have more resources, you invested more in R&D. We also don't want to be the last guy at the party when they turn the lights off and find, man, wish we didn't make all of our iPhones here in China. So, what's your advice to business leaders who are trying to figure out that balance of, we want to leverage the best opportunities, we want to access markets, but we don't want to get caught without a paddle if the geopolitical risks jump the shark?
I think one of the most important lessons from Ukraine is that if you haven't thought about these questions until the war starts or the crisis starts, you're likely to be making really weighty decisions in a really short period of time with inadequate information. And so there were too many firms that basically had to decide in a matter of hours whether they were going to wind down operations in Russia or not. And you don't want to be caught in that position when something 10 times worse happens in the Western Pacific. And so thing one that I've basically told anybody who will listen is that it's worth running the scenario. It's worth running the war game now. If there's a blockade of Taiwan, what are the implications for you? What are the decisions you have to make within the first 36 hours, within the first 6 weeks, and so on and so forth, right? If it's an invasion, how does that change? And so on and so forth. And at the very least, that puts you in a position where you've done some of the intellectual reps beforehand, and so you're not caught so flat-footed. The second thing, and this is more helpful to some firms than to others, is to try not to think about this just in terms of downside. There may be upside as well. There are a lot of businesses out there that frankly can profit from a degree of geopolitical volatility. If you're in the shipping business, for instance, you may be profiting from what's happening in the Red Sea right now. And so if we think that we're headed into a more geopolitically volatile world, that's going to create opportunities as well as risks. And the third thing I would just say is that it has become ever more important for business leaders and political leaders or foreign policy leaders to be speaking to each other and speaking the same language, because these worlds are going to collide in increasingly sharp ways in coming years, either because it's hard to make prudent decisions about U.S.-China policy without understanding the supply chain implications, or because what the United States does or doesn't do in a Taiwan crisis is going to have massive effects for hundreds of American firms. And so I think having that dialogue is important, whether you're doing it sort of in a structured way, whether you're bringing more talent in-house, or you're looking to do it more opportunistically.
So I'm sure the incoming folks have and will continue, I hope, to in the Trump administration to seek your counsel and your perspective. What's the advice you would give to the incoming foreign policy and national security team within the Trump administration? In part, as I read the Eurasian Century, there are a whole lot of lessons that history tells us that remain applicable. But I also tend to think that different times sometimes call for different strategies. So you get a chance to come in with Secretary Rubio, and National Security Advisor Waltz and others. What is Hal Brand's advice?
Well, one thing is relatively narrow, but I think it's important, which is that I just don't think the U.S. national security community has wrapped its head around what it means to see the forms of collaboration between our adversaries that we are seeing today. And sometimes that's for seemingly mundane but really important bureaucratic reasons, like the fact that the Pentagon typically plans to fight one adversary at once. But how does it change the equation if we have to assume that in a U.S.-China war in the Western Pacific, China is going to be getting some form of support from Russia, whether because Russia is carrying out cyber attacks against U.S. targets or is backfilling the Chinese when it comes to munitions and things like that? How does that change our assumptions about these wars? What would it mean if we had to fight in more than one place at once? That is a scenario the U.S. has basically ruled out in its defense strategy over the past decade, but it's one that's become ever more likely today. The other point I would make, which I think is particularly relevant to the team and the president that are coming in, is that you got to strike the right balance in terms of whipping U.S. allies into shape is maybe the way of putting it. And so when President Trump says that President-elect Trump says that the Europeans aren't spending enough on defense, Japan and Taiwan aren't spending enough on defense. He is correct. There is no way that the U.S. and its allies can sort of make the global military math work at the level of military spending that's happening right now. And, if it, just to put a very fine point on this, if Japan and Taiwan really perceive an existential threat from China, then the fact that neither of them are spending 3% of GDP on defense is just mind-blowing. And so absolutely, you're going to need some tough love to get these alliances into a place where they will be capable of supporting U.S. foreign policy in the way that it needs to be supported. The balance, though, comes from the fact that if you are too abrasive in doing this and you make it seem as though you are fundamentally uncommitted to the alliances because you don't see their value, well, you may not get the effort that you want, or you may simply lead U.S. allies to conclude that they're not going to be able to rely on you over the long term, and so they need to make alternative arrangements, like developing their own nuclear weapons. And so I think that tension is always hard to resolve. It's inherent in U.S. foreign policy. And I think it'll be especially challenging for this team because I think there's some degree of internal conflict on these issues.
You were such a sharp and concise answer of questions that I get to ask you my bonus question. So I lied. The last question, and the last question is two-part, but it's easy. Who do you read regularly that you find valuable? Let's not count the major papers, but rather whether it's Substacks or maybe stuff a little bit off the beaten path. And what's Hal Brand's next book? Because Hal Brand always has a next book in mind.
Okay, so on Substacks, there's a couple that I would recommend. One for kind of the military affairs buffs out there is by a guy named Mick Ryan. He's a retired Australian Army general who has been very prominent in writing about Ukraine and a host of other military issues since he retired about 3 or 4 years ago. I recommend it very highly. It's a great guide both to sort of the course of the war in Ukraine, but then also to bigger issues surrounding military and technological innovation. A somewhat broader one is Noah Smith. And
Love
so
Noah.
you know Noah, obviously. He and I did a discussion with you last summer, I believe. And Noah's an economist by trade, and so he writes a lot about economics. He writes a lot about politics, but he's also got sort of a good geopolitical sensibility. And he's been thinking a lot recently about the intersection between manufacturing, the ability to make things, and global power and outcomes in war. And I find his work fascinating. So I can't recommend it highly enough. Um, in terms of my next things, I've got a couple of next things. So I'm doing an edited compilation, so sort of a collective effort later this year where I'm going to get about 15 people together, and we are going to try to figure out what the lessons of the first decade of the U.S.-China great power competition are. And then the next book that I will write all by myself is called The Landscape of Power, and it is an effort to explain America's geopolitical position in common sense terms and to help people think through how the geography of key regions shapes global affairs even today.
Well, I plan to have you back because we got to keep pace with everybody else. But Hal, I really appreciate the book, The Eurasian Century. It really is. It's a wonderful history, and it makes you think about all these topics we talked about, which is also the present and the future. I appreciate your being here. We will send a link to those of you who are here. As noted, I got 100 copies and then I run out. If it says we ran out, we ran out. And I love Hal, but I'm buying 100 copies and then I'm good. So at that point, I encourage you to go on Amazon and if you have conferences, Hal is a great, great, thoughtful dude, as you just saw, to have in an armchair to do a Q&A with. Hal, thanks for making the time, man.
Thanks for having me, Bruce. I always enjoy these.
Awesome.